So what does it mean to act like a monopoly? How do monopolies determine what price to sell things for and how much to sell things for? So let's look at monopolies and how they make decisions. Well, monopolies are run by people, and people we know act rationally. So when we talk about how people make decisions, remember we said earlier this semester that if the extra benefit is more than the extra cost, then we do it. And if the extra benefit is less than the extra cost, then we don't do it. If the question on hand is how much of something to do or not do, then we're going to stop when the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. Well, for the perfectly competitive market, the extra benefit of selling one more good was the price that they got to sell it for. So in a perfectly competitive market, perfectly competitive markets produce until price is equal to marginal cost. And so you think back to our graphs, you are a price taker and you went across until price was equal to marginal cost, and that determined the quantity. Well, what about the monopoly? Well, the monopoly can't just charge anything they want, right? You can't charge $1 million for a copy of Microsoft Office. You have to consider customers and what they are willing and able to buy. So monopolies still have to consider the market demand, okay, when they are setting the price. But monopolies are not price takers. And so when they look at this decision about whether the extra benefit is more than the extra cost, the difference for them is that they're not a price taker. The price is not fixed. Now they're still looking at stopping when the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. So we have to figure out where that is and how that happens. Well, think about this demand curve. So if we're looking at this on a graph, here's price, here's quantity. Okay. If a monopoly wants to sell more quantity, okay, well, how do they get customers to buy more? They're going to have to drop the price. Because they can't just charge anything they want and sell anything they want, they have to consider the market demand. What are customers willing and able to buy? So if a monopoly wants to sell more, they're going to have to lower the price. So then we're not just going to produce until price is equal to marginal cost. We will consider marginal cost in our scenario, but the price is not fixed, unlike with the perfectly competitive market. So what we look at instead is what is called marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is the extra money that comes in from selling one more item. And remember, if you want to sell one more item, so you want to increase quantity, then you're going to have to lower the price. So we start by looking at total revenue, which is price times quantity. And marginal revenue is going to be that change in total revenue when you change the quantity. So if I sell one more, how much extra will I bring in to the business? All right, so let's take a look at that. So we talked about total revenue as price times the quantity, and marginal revenue you can see here with this triangle. That triangle is a mathematical symbol called delta, and so this is the extra, the change in total revenue that we get from a change in quantity. All right, so we seem to be having some technical difficulties here, so I'm just going to close the slides and bring it back open. And while we're doing that, let's look at this here. So this little cartoon says we've merged, making us the largest cold drink provider in the neighborhood. And you'll notice in this case, lemonade prices have gone up, right? Because with less competition, the price increases. And so we can look at monopolies and how they choose what price to set things at, what quantity to sell. And monopolies intentionally produce less so that they can charge more. So we get those slides back up and running. All right, so we talked before about how perfectly competitive markets, they're going to produce until price is equal to marginal cost. It is the same decision as looking at where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. For the perfectly competitive market, price is marginal revenue. Okay. Now, what about the monopoly? So, in order for the monopoly to figure out how much to sell and at what price, they need to figure out where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So let's do some calculations to find marginal revenue. First, we find total revenue, which is price times quantity. And so, for example, here we have the demand curve, quantities and prices, and that relationship between prices and quantities. And so total revenue, if we sold 1 unit at 20 bucks, total revenue would be 20. Okay? If we sold 2 units at a price of 19, then we would take 19 times 2, and we get 38. Okay. Then if we want to sell more, you increase the quantity, you have to drop the price. So now we are doing 3 units at $18, or 54. And we can keep going. If we want to sell 4 units, we're going to have to drop the price lower. And now we're selling at 17. Well, $17 for 4 units is a total of $68. So we can continue calculating total revenue for all the different combinations of prices and quantities. Marginal revenue is going to be the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. So when we go from 1 to 2, we look at how much extra in total revenue we're bringing in. When we have 0 quantity, the total revenue we're bringing in is 0. So our marginal revenue, when we go from 0 units to 1 unit, the extra money that comes in is the 20 bucks we make off the sale of that first unit. Now, when we go and sell a second unit, quantity changed by 1, the amount of money we're bringing in, we went from 20 bucks to 38 bucks. So the marginal revenue is 18. When we go from selling 2 units to 3 units, remember we had to drop the price to get customers to buy more. Total revenue increased from 38 to 54. And when we look at the difference between 54 and 38, we get 16. When we go from selling 3 units to 4 units, again, we had to drop the price to get more customers to buy. And we go from bringing in $54 to $68. Okay, so here the marginal revenue is 14. We're making an extra 14 bucks. Now notice that the extra money we're bringing in when we sell 1 more unit is not the price. And that's because if you want to sell more units, remember that demand curve is downward sloping. If you want to sell more units, you're going to have to drop the price on all the units. Okay. All right, so we have marginal revenue. We know how much extra we're going to bring in. The question then is, how much is the monopoly willing to sell and at what price? Okay. Well, if we keep going in our calculations, we'll find that total revenue keeps going up. So in fact, if we could look at here, 11 times 10, here we're at 110 units. Lastly, we're here at 12 times 9, 108 units. So eventually total revenue will decline. Okay, you'll have dropped the price so much that the amount of money that you're bringing in will be less. And so the marginal revenue will eventually become negative. All right, so is that where we stop? Do we produce at a price of $9 and a quantity of 12? At that point, the extra money you're bringing in is negative. Do you stop here where marginal revenue is negative? Where when you sell an item, the extra money you bring in is 0? Or do you stop earlier? Well, we know that if the extra benefit is more than the extra cost, we do it. If the extra benefit is less than the extra cost, we don't do it. And we know we stop where the extra benefit is equal to the extra cost. So we don't look at where marginal revenue equals 0 or where it's negative. We need to compare marginal revenue, the extra money we bring in, which is the benefit we get from selling an item, to the extra cost to make the item. So you want to sell an item as long as the extra money you bring in is more than the extra cost to make it. And you don't want to sell items if the extra cost to make it is more than the extra money you bring in when you sell it. So we want to look for the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So how do we do that? Well, we go to our graph. So here we have our demand curve. And that demand curve is based on these prices and quantities that we just looked at. And we have our marginal revenue curve, which is based on those numbers you just calculated. Okay? And we add to that our marginal cost curve that we've discussed earlier this semester. So how does a monopoly decide how much to make and sell? Well, when we look at, here is the point. Let's start here. At 2 units, here is the extra cost to make 2 units. And if we go straight up, there's the extra benefit, the extra money we bring in when we sell those 2 units. So we can see that the extra cost is a lot less than the extra money we're bringing in, which makes us happy and makes us want to sell more. Well, what about at this end? Well, here we can see the extra money we bring in is small, about $2. The extra cost to make it is much higher at about 16. So the extra cost to make it is significantly higher than the extra money that we're going to bring in from selling it. So we don't want to do that. So where do we stop? We stop where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue. This is the quantity that we're going to produce. Okay. So here, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, that's going to determine the quantity for the monopoly. Well, how much do you charge? Should we charge, what is that, just over $8? Should we charge over $8 for that, what do we have here? Just under 7 units. Well, the thing is that we know exactly how much customers are willing and able to pay for this quantity that we have just determined. Well, how do we know what customers are willing and able to pay? We can go to the demand curve. And so we can see on the demand curve that for this quantity, at about 7 units, just under 7 units, we can see how much customers are willing to pay for those units based on the demand curve. So when you determine how much a monopoly is willing to sell, that's the quantity where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And then you go up to the demand curve to figure out how much customers are willing and able to pay for that quantity. Now, as we look at this, we need to know, are we making economic profit, right? So perfectly competitive markets, they did not make economic profit in the long run because there were no barriers to entry or exit. But recall that monopolies exist because we have barriers to entry. What were those 3 barriers? Legal, technical, and economic. So if there's barriers to entry, then what does that mean for economic profit? Well, do we have enough from this graph to answer that question? Well, we need one more curve to be able to determine whether or not this company is making economic profit. What curve is that? We're missing that average total cost curve. So if we add in our average total cost curve, and my apologies, it's really hard to make curves on the computer, but the lowest point on this curve should be here, where it intersects marginal cost. Okay, but notice that we are not producing at that quantity. Monopolies intentionally produce less, so there's the quantity for the monopoly, so that they can charge more. And then how do we tell if the monopoly is making economic profit? Well, at this quantity, we go down to the average total cost curve, and we can see this difference here is the amount of profit per unit times the quantity that the monopoly is selling. And so this here is all the economic profit that the monopoly is making.